Colorado, 1870. At a dust-worn trading post on the edge of the frontier. Maeve knelt on the wooden floor, head bowed low, hands still scrubbing without pause when a low, steady voice spoke behind her. "I see your heart." A woman treated like a worthless burden by her own family for 12 long years, never imagining anyone could see past the mask of submission she wore until a rugged stranger walked into her life. This story starting right now. Stay till the end to see how Maeve's whole world changes. The trading post smelled like leather, tobacco, and dust that never quite settled. Maeve Sullivan knelt on the plank floor, scrub brush in hand, water gone gray and cold around her knuckles. Her hands were cracked from lye soap and winter wind, but they moved in the same steady rhythm they always did. Scrub, rinse, wring, scrub, rinse, wring. She had learned a long time ago that if her hands kept moving, nobody looked too close at her face. The bell over the door jingled. Boots on wood, slow and unhurried. Maeve didn't look up. She'd learned that too. Elias Vance stood behind the counter, counting coins into a tin box, muttering numbers under his breath, like a man saying a prayer he didn't believe in. He miscounted. Anyone with eyes could see it. He'd shorted a customer 3 days back and covered it by blaming the till. And now he'd done it again, this time to himself. And he needed somewhere to put the blame. His eyes found Maeve. "You?" His voice cracked across the room like a whip finding its mark. "What did you do with the silver I left on this counter?" Maeve stayed on her knees. She kept her eyes low, the way she'd trained herself to, since she was 12 years old, and first understood that looking up meant getting hit. "I haven't touched your counter. Uncle, don't lie to me." "Girl," he came around, boots heavy, and jabbed a finger toward her. "Worthless charity case. That's what you are. I feed you. I clothe you. And this is the thanks I get. Thieving under my own roof." A woman near the flour barrels turned to watch. A man buying rope paused mid-reach. This was the show Elias liked to put on, loud enough to reach every corner of the store. Because a man who yells first is a man nobody questions. Maeve bowed her head lower. Her jaw was tight enough to ache, but her voice, when it came, was soft, small. The voice of a girl who knew her place. "I'm sorry, Uncle Elias. I'll look for it," he grunted, satisfied, and turned back to his tin box, like a king returning to his throne. He didn't see her hand slide across the floorboards. He didn't see her fingers close around the coin he himself had dropped not 5 minutes before, the one rolling near the barrel, where nobody but her had thought to look. She tucked it into her apron pocket without breaking the rhythm of her scrubbing. Scrub, rinse, wring, it wasn't much. A single coin wasn't going to buy her a train ticket or a new life, but it was hers now, earned by her own hands in a house that gave her nothing freely. And every coin she hid away was one step closer to a ledger. Only she could read. She'd been teaching herself figures at night by candlelight, borrowed books hidden under a loose floorboard. Someday the numbers would add up to freedom. She just had to be patient. That was when she noticed him. A man leaned against the far end of the counter, hat low, arms crossed. He hadn't said a word since he walked in. Ranch dust on his boots, a Colt on his hip that looked like it had seen use, and not for show. He was watching her. Not the way the other customers watched, curious and quick to look away. He was watching like a man reading a book he already knew the ending to. Maeve's stomach dropped. He'd seen the coin. She braced for it, for him to call out, to point, to give Elias one more reason to make an example of her in front of the whole store. Instead, the man pushed off the counter and walked toward the door, spurs ringing soft against the floorboards. He passed close by her. Close enough that when he paused, she felt the shadow of him fall over her bent shoulders. He crouched, just slightly, enough to bring his eyes level with hers, without ever quite looking at her, straight on, the way you'd crouch to talk to a spooked colt, instead of cornering it. "I see your heart," he said low, steady, like a man stating a fact about the weather. Then he stood, settled his hat, and walked out into the Colorado afternoon, like he hadn't just cracked something open in her chest. Maeve stayed frozen on her knees. brush forgotten in the gray water. Nobody else in the store had heard him. Elias hadn't looked up from his coins, but she'd heard it. 4 words that undid 12 years of careful hiding in the space of a breath. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew that, for the first time since she was a child, someone had looked past the bowed head and the soft voice and seen the person underneath, the one who counted coins in the dark and dreamed of leaving. That night, lying on her thin mattress in the storeroom she called a bedroom, Maeve pressed her palm flat against her chest, right where he'd looked. Nobody had ever called it a heart before. Elias called it debt. Martha called it duty. But a stranger with dust on his boots had looked at her for 5 seconds and called it a heart. She didn't sleep much, but for once, it wasn't fear keeping her awake. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of Colorado morning where the mountains looked close enough to touch and the air bit at your knuckles. Maeve was already sweeping the porch when she heard hooves on the frozen road, slow and deliberate. Not the rushed clatter of a man late for something. She looked up and saw him. Same hat, same dust-colored coat, same horse with a white blaze down its nose. He tied off at the post, like he'd done it 100 times before, though she'd never seen him in town until yesterday. Elias came out from behind the counter the second the bell rang, rubbing his hands together the way he did whenever a stranger with money walked through his door. "Morning, friend. What can Vance's trading post do for you today?" The man didn't answer right away. He walked to the counter, reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded paper. He set it down flat, smoothing the crease with 2 fingers before he spoke. "Name's Silas Thorne. I run the Thorne cattle operation, 12 miles east. Heard of you." Elias's eyes flicked to the paper, then back up. "Good land out that way." "It is." Silas tapped the paper once. "This here's an employment contract. Fair wage, room and board. Signed and witnessed by Judge Calloway in town. I'm looking to hire your niece. Ledger work and cooking for my crew." Maeve had frozen with the broom still in her hands. She stood in the doorway between the porch and the store, close enough to hear every word. And her heart had started up a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear this time. It was something closer to hope. And hope was a dangerous thing to feel in that house. Elias's face did something complicated. Surprise first, then the calculation she knew well. The one where he figured out how to turn any situation to his advantage. "She's not for hire," he said. "She's family. She owes this household for every meal she's eaten since she was 12 years old." "Funny thing about a debt like that," Silas said, and his voice never rose, never sharpened. It just stayed level. The way a man talks when he's already decided how the conversation ends. Nobody ever seems to write it down. No ledger for it. No number. Just a debt that never gets smaller, no matter how much a person pays. Elias's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone in my store. I'm not raising my voice." "Elias, I'm asking a question." Silas turned, and for the first time he looked straight at Maeve, standing in the doorway with the broom still gripped in both hands. "Miss Sullivan, this is your choice to make, not his. I'm offering honest work and a fair wage. You'd have your own room, your own pay, in your own hand, every month. Nobody's buying you. I'm hiring you." The store went quiet, except for the crackle of the stove in the corner. Martha had come out from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, watching, with the flat, careful expression of a woman who'd survived a long marriage by staying out of her husband's tempers. Maeve set the broom against the doorframe. Her hands were shaking, but she made them still. "I'm 24 years old," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm not a child, and I'm not property. I can make my own choices. You'll make the choice I tell you to make." Elias snapped, and he crossed the floor fast, faster than she expected for a man his age, and grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. Silas moved before she could even flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't draw. He simply stepped between them, close enough that Elias had to let go or shove past him, and his hand came to rest, easy and unhurried, on the grip of the Colt at his hip. Not a threat exactly, just a fact, laid out plain for anyone to see. People aren't cattle to be branded. Elias, his voice hadn't changed at all, still low, still even. The law might turn a blind eye to how you talk to her in this store. But on my land, a person's sweat is bought with respect, nothing less. Elias's face went red, then pale, calculating the odds of a fight he wouldn't win. He stepped back. "Get out," he said. "Both of you. And don't think you're taking a single thing that belongs to this house." "I don't want anything of yours," Maeve said quietly. "I never did." She walked out with nothing but the dress on her back and the coin still tucked in her apron pocket, the one she'd hidden for weeks. Small proof that she'd always been planning to leave, even before she had somewhere to go. Silas didn't offer his arm. He didn't rush her. He just walked beside her to the wagon, matching her pace, and helped her up onto the seat like she weighed nothing at all, and like the gesture meant nothing at all, which somehow made it mean more. As the wagon pulled away, Maeve looked back once at the trading post, at Elias standing in the doorway with his fists clenched, at Martha watching from the window with an expression Maeve couldn't read. Then she faced forward and didn't look back again. "You didn't have to do that," she said after a long stretch of silence, the wheels creaking beneath them. "Didn't have to. Wanted to." Silas kept his eyes on the road, saw how he talked to you yesterday, saw the coin too, for what it's worth. Man drops his own silver and blames a woman on her knees for it. That's not a mistake. That's a habit. Maeve's face went hot. "You're not going to report it." "Report what?" "A man too careless to keep track of his own money." A faint curve touched the corner of his mouth, the closest to a smile she'd seen from him. "No, ma'am, way I see it. You earned that coin, scrubbing his floors longer than most men would have lasted." She didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever taken her side of anything before, not without wanting something in return. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the set of his shoulders, the calm way he held the reins, and wondered what the cost of his kindness would turn out to be. Every kindness she'd ever known had come with a bill attached. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why hire me? You don't know me." "Watched you for 20 minutes yesterday," Silas said. "Watched you keep your head down and your hands steady, while a man twice your size screamed insults at you in front of a room full of strangers. Man who does that isn't broken. He's biding his time." He glanced at her, just once, then back to the road. "I need someone who can keep a ledger straight and won't crack under pressure." Figured a woman who survived 12 years of that house has both qualities in spades. Maeve looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the cracked knuckles, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to be valued for what she could do instead of punished for what she couldn't. "Thank you," she said. "No need for that." Silas flicked the reins gently. "You'll earn your keep. That's the deal. Nothing given for free. Nothing owed beyond a day's honest work. That's how it works on my land." The wagon rolled on toward the mountains, and Maeve, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let her shoulders drop from around her ears. The ride to the ranch took the better part of a day, winding through valleys, still crusted with the last of the winter snow, past creeks running high and fast with the melt. Maeve sat stiff on the wagon seat for the first hour, spine straight, hands folded tight in her lap, waiting. She kept waiting for the moment he'd show his true face. Every man she'd ever known had one face for company and another for when the door was shut. Elias smiled at customers and screamed at her in the storeroom. She figured Silas Thorne would be no different, once they were far enough from town that nobody could hear. "You're awful quiet," Silas said after a long stretch of silence, not looking at her, eyes on the road. "Didn't think you wanted conversation." "Didn't say that." He shifted the reins to one hand. "Just noticed you've been sitting, like you're bracing for a blow, since we left town. Wondered if you were cold, or if it was something else." Maeve's cheeks warmed despite the chill in the air. She hadn't realized it was so obvious. "I'm fine," she said. "All right." He let it go. Easy as that. No push, no prying. They rode another mile in silence before he spoke again. Softer this time. "Nobody's going to touch you on my land. Miss Sullivan. Not me. Not my hands. Not anybody. You've got my word on that. And my word's worth more than most contracts you'll find in this territory." She didn't answer, But something in her chest loosened just slightly. A knot she hadn't known was there until it started to ease. The sky had been gray and heavy since morning, and by early afternoon it broke open. Not a gentle rain either. A spring storm rolled down off the peaks, fast and mean, wind-driving sheets of icy water sideways across the road. And within minutes, the dirt track had turned to a soup of mud and melting snow. The wagon lurched, dropped, and one wheel sank into a hole hidden beneath the churned mud, deep enough that the axle groaned and the horses strained against their harness without moving an inch. Silas swore under his breath, jumped down into mud that swallowed his boots to the ankle, and moved to the front to calm the horses before they panicked and did real damage. Maeve sat frozen on the seat for half a second, rain plastering her hair to her face, before instinct took over. She climbed down too. "Get back up there," Silas called over the wind. "You'll ruin your dress." "It's already ruined," she shouted back. And it was true. The hem already soaked black with mud. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her for a moment, rain running down his face, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the first real measure of respect. "Grab that plank," he said, pointing to a length of wood lashed to the side of the wagon. "We wedge it under the wheel. Give it something to catch on. On my count, I'll push from the back. You work the plank." She didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She hauled the plank through mud that dragged at her skirts and dropped to her knees beside the sunken wheel, jamming the wood down into the muck with both hands, bracing it against a rock buried in the mud. "Now," Silas called, throwing his shoulder against the back of the wagon. Maeve pushed with everything she had, arms burning, breath coming in ragged gasps, rain stinging her eyes. The wheel caught, spun, caught again, and with a sucking groan, the wagon lurched free of the mud hole and rolled forward onto firmer ground. Silas straightened up, chest heaving. Mud splattered up one side of his face. He looked at her, kneeling in the muck with the plank still clutched in her hands, soaked through and filthy and grinning despite herself. And he laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, like it had caught him off guard. "Never met a woman who'd jump into mud like that without being asked twice," he said, offering her his hand. She took it. His grip was rough, calloused, and steady, and he pulled her up out of the mud like she weighed nothing. "Never met a man who'd expect me to sit pretty on a wagon seat while he did the work alone," she said. Something passed between them then, quick and quiet, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. She wasn't a burden to be carried. She was a partner, capable of pulling her own weight, and he'd seen it plain the moment she jumped down into the mud without waiting to be told. They rode the rest of the way, soaked to the bone and shivering. But Maeve found she didn't mind the cold nearly as much as she expected. There was something steadying about having worked alongside someone, shoulder to shoulder, mud to the elbows, and having it mean something. By the time the ranch house came into view, its windows glowing gold against the darkening sky, rain still misting down around them, Maeve realized she'd stopped bracing for a blow. She was watching the light in the windows instead and wondering, for the first time in years, what it might feel like to walk through a door and actually be welcome on the other side. The ranch house was smaller than Maeve expected, but solid, built of thick timber with a stone chimney that ran the full height of one wall. A housekeeper named Ruth met them at the door with dry towels and hot coffee, fussing over the state of them both without asking a single question about why they were covered head to toe in mud. Maeve's room was at the end of the hall, small but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the pasture. She stood in the doorway for a long moment after Ruth left her there, just looking at it. A room of her own, a door that locked from the inside. She hadn't had either in 12 years. The first weeks fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the kitchen, feeding a crew of 6 ranch hands who ate like they hadn't seen a hot meal in a month and thanked her every single time without fail. Afternoons in the small office off the parlor, Silas's ledgers spread across the desk, columns of numbers that hadn't been balanced properly in over a year. She lost herself in the work, And for the first time in her life, nobody stood over her shoulder, waiting for a mistake to punish. But old habits didn't let go easily. Ruth noticed first. She mentioned it to Silas one evening. Quiet, over coffee on the porch, after Maeve had gone to bed. Said the girl had taken to slipping biscuits and bread heels into her apron pocket at supper, tucking them away, like she was hoarding for a winter that hadn't come yet. Said she'd found crumbs under Maeve's pillow more than once. Silas didn't say much in response. He just nodded, thanked Ruth for telling him, and went to bed with something heavy sitting behind his ribs. He didn't confront her about it. He'd learned enough about her in those first weeks to know that shame wouldn't fix what fear had built. Instead, the next morning, Maeve woke to find a fresh loaf of bread sitting on a clean cloth just inside her bedroom door, still warm like it had been baked before dawn and carried up while she slept. There was no note, no explanation, just bread, freely given, no strings attached. She stood in her doorway holding it, and her throat went tight in a way she didn't have a name for. She understood the message even though nobody had spoken it aloud. Nobody in this house was going to let her go hungry. She didn't need to steal safety a crumb at a time anymore. It happened again the next morning, and the next. A loaf of bread, or sometimes a jar of preserves, or a wedge of cheese wrapped in paper, always left quiet and wordless outside her door. She never saw who left it, though she had a fair idea, and she never mentioned it at breakfast. Though something in the way, Silas glanced at her over his coffee, told her he knew that she knew. It was 3 weeks into her stay that the old habit came to a head in a different way entirely. Maeve had grown up believing that nothing came without a price. Elias and Martha had drilled it into her since childhood. Every scrap of food, every worn-out dress, every night under their roof, all of it logged somewhere in an invisible ledger she owed against. She couldn't shake the feeling that Silas's kindness was building toward the same kind of bill, even though every part of him seemed to contradict it. Late one night, unable to sleep, turning the thought over and over until it felt unbearable, she got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked down the hall to his door. She told herself she was simply settling accounts, getting ahead of the debt before it came due on someone else's terms instead of her own. She knocked, soft, and he opened the door a moment later, still dressed, a book in one hand like he hadn't been sleeping either. Maeve, something wrong? No. She twisted her fingers together in front of her. I wanted to talk to you about paying you back. For the job, the room, all of it. Silas's brow furrowed. You're doing that already. Every day you balance my books and feed my crew. I meant something else. Her voice dropped, and she hated how small it sounded. How much it reminded her of the girl she used to be on her knees at the trading post. I could come inside, settle things properly. That's how it's usually done. For a moment, he just looked at her, and she watched understanding move across his face, followed by something that looked almost like grief. Maeve, he said her name gently, the way you'd talk to someone standing too close to a ledge. Come here a second. He didn't pull her inside. Instead, he stepped out into the hallway, reached back into his room, and took the heavy canvas coat hanging by the door, the one he wore out to check the herd in bad weather. He draped it over her shoulders. Careful, like she might startle and bolt if he moved too fast. Your body belongs to you, he said. Not to me, not to your uncle, not to anybody who ever made you believe different. It isn't currency. It isn't a debt to be collected at midnight in some hallway. He tucked the coat closed at her collar, his hands never lingering. You owe me a hard day's work on this land, and that's the whole of it. Nothing more. You understand me. Her eyes stung, and she hated that they did. Hated how close she was to crying in front of him. I don't know how to just be given something, she whispered. Nobody's ever given me anything without wanting it back. I know. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. That's not going to change overnight, but it starts somewhere. Might as well start tonight. He nodded toward her room. Go get some sleep. Ledgers don't balance themselves, and I've got 6 hungry men expecting breakfast at dawn, whether you slept a wink or not. She managed a shaky laugh at that, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and turned toward her room. still wrapped in his coat. Silas, he paused, one hand on his door. Thank you. For the bread, too. I know it was you. The faintest smile crossed his face. There and gone. Get some sleep. Maeve, she walked back to her room in his coat. And that night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't tuck a single crumb of bread under her pillow. She left the loaf sitting whole on the table by her bed, trusting, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that it would still be there in the morning, simply because nobody was keeping score. Winter closed in hard that year, snow stacking against the fence posts, until the pasture looked like a white sea, with fence rails poking up like the masts of sunken ships. The ranch hands cut their outdoor work to the essentials, feeding the herd, breaking ice on the water troughs, keeping the barn roof clear of snow load. And Maeve found herself with long stretches of quiet afternoons in the office, a lamp burning low. The ledgers spread across the desk in front of her. She'd taken to the work faster than she expected. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way people rarely did. A column either balanced or it didn't. There was no lying to a ledger, no smiling at a customer while shorting them behind the counter. She found a kind of peace in it, tracing entries back through months of Silas's records, most of them kept in his own rough hand before she arrived. Honest, but not always careful. It was on a gray afternoon in late January, snow falling steady outside the window, that she first noticed the numbers didn't add up. She'd been cross-referencing the cattle count from the fall roundup against the tally from the previous spring, a habit she'd built simply to keep her mind sharp, and found a gap. 14 head unaccounted for, not unusual on its own. Cattle wandered, got taken by wolves, fell into ravines. Ranch life had its losses, but 14 felt like a lot for one season, and something about the number nagged at her. She pulled the supply manifests next, records of goods bought and sold that Silas kept for tax purposes, and set them beside the cattle counts. And there, buried in a column of numbers that would have meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 12 years memorizing the rhythms of a trading post ledger, she found something that made her sit up straight in her chair. The manifest showed a delivery of hides to Vance's trading post in October, sold by a rancher whose name she didn't recognize, a man called Boyd, from a spread 2 valleys over. The count matched. 14 hides. Maeve sat very still for a long moment, the lamp hissing softly beside her, snow ticking against the window glass. She'd spent enough hours behind that same counter to know her uncle's handwriting, his particular way of fudging a total, rounding down what he owed and rounding up what was owed to him. And she recognized, buried in the manifest, the same careful hand that had logged her own labor as worth nothing for 12 straight years. She spent the rest of the evening pulling every manifest she could find, going back through the fall and into the summer before, cross-referencing names, dates, head counts. By the time the lamp burned low and her eyes ached from strain, she had a picture forming that turned her stomach cold. It wasn't just Silas's ranch. 3 other outfits in the valley had reported missing cattle over the past year. Small numbers each time. 5 here, 8 there, nothing large enough to draw real suspicion on its own. But every single time, matching count of hides or beef had passed through Vance's trading post within weeks, sold under names Maeve was fairly certain didn't exist, men nobody in town had ever actually met. Her uncle was running cattle he didn't own through a network of fake sellers, skimming a slow and steady theft from half the valley, small enough that no one rancher noticed the bleed, but large enough, added together, to explain how a man with a modest trading post had somehow built himself a fine brick house on the edge of town. She found Silas in the barn near midnight, checking on a mare close to foaling, lantern light throwing long shadows across the stalls. He looked up when she came in, stamping snow off her boots, cheeks flushed from the cold and something else. "You should be asleep," he said, then took a second look at her face and set down the brush in his hand. "What is it?" "I found something." She held out the papers, hands not quite steady, in the ledgers. "I think I know what happened to your missing cattle." He took the papers, moved closer to the lantern, and read in silence while she explained it to him, walking him through the manifests, the names that didn't match any family in the valley, the pattern that repeated itself across 4 different ranches over the better part of a year. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, eyes hard in the lantern light. "Your uncle," he said finally. "I think so. I can't prove it outright. Not yet, not with what I have here. But the pattern's too clean to be coincidence. He's been doing this a long time. Silas, skimming small enough that nobody adds it up. Except I did. I know his handwriting. I know how he thinks." Silas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Respect layered over something warmer that neither of them had put a name to yet. "You did this from an office ledger and a stack of manifests nobody else thought to compare. I spent 12 years learning how that man cheats people," Maeve said. "Figured it was about time that knowledge did some good instead of just keeping me safe." He set the papers down carefully on a bale of hay, out of reach of the lantern's open flame, and reached out, not touching her exactly, just close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold barn air. "You understand what this means. If he finds out, you know. If he even suspects you know. He's not going to let it sit. A man built a life on this kind of theft doesn't let one ledger clerk unravel it without a fight." I know, her chin lifted, steady despite the fear sitting low in her stomach. "But I'm done being afraid of him in the dark. Silas, if we do this right, out in the open, with proof, he doesn't get to hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. And every rancher in this valley he's been quietly stealing from." Silas studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression settled, like a decision he'd been circling for weeks had finally landed. "All right, then." He picked the papers back up, tucked them carefully inside his coat. "We do it together. You keep building the case in those ledgers. Quiet, careful. Nobody in town gets word of what you're doing. I'll ride out to the other ranches that lost cattle. See if their manifests match what you found here. We build it brick by brick until it's too solid for a corrupt sheriff or a scared judge to wave away." "You believe me," Maeve said quietly, just like that. No questions, no doubt. "I've watched you balance 6 months of my books to the penny without complaint," Silas said. "I've watched you read a supply manifest the way most men read a newspaper. You've got a mind for this, Maeve, sharper than most men I've hired to do the same work. Course I believe you." They stayed in the barn another hour, the mare shifting restlessly in her stall, snow piling up quiet against the doors, going through the papers line by line, Maeve explaining the small tricks she recognized from years of watching her uncle work. Silas asking sharp questions that helped her see connections she'd missed on her own. It didn't feel like employer and employee anymore. Hadn't for weeks, if she was honest with herself. It felt like 2 minds working toward the same goal, equal weight given to each idea. And there was something intoxicating about being taken seriously, about having her thinking matched instead of dismissed. Later, walking back to the house together through fresh snow, their lantern the only light for miles, Silas spoke again. Quieter this time. "You did good work tonight. Maeve, better than good. You might have just saved half this valley a fortune, and maybe worse than money. Once your uncle's theft catches up to feeding something bigger, we did it together," she corrected. "I found the pattern. You're the one willing to ride out in the dead of winter to prove it." He glanced sideways at her, a small smile ghosting across his face, snow catching in his eyelashes. "Partners, then," he said. "Partners," she agreed, and the word settled warm in her chest despite the bitter cold. A promise neither of them had quite meant to make out loud, but both of them intended to keep. The blizzard came without much warning. The worst ones always did in that country. One morning the sky hung low and gray, wind picking up steady from the north, and by noon it had turned into something that swallowed the mountains whole. Snow driving sideways, so thick a man couldn't see past his own outstretched hand. Silas had the crew working fast from first light, hauling extra feed to the herd, checking every gate and fence line before the worst of it hit. Because cattle caught in open pasture during a storm like this, one could freeze standing up or pile against a fence and smother each other in the panic. It was dangerous work in good weather. In a blizzard, it was the kind of work men got hurt doing. Maeve stayed at the house, feeding the fire, keeping coffee hot for the men when they stumbled in half-frozen between checks, watching the window every few minutes, even though there was nothing to see but white. Silas came in near dusk, soaked through, half his mustache crusted with ice, and told her he was heading back out one more time to check the north fence line before full dark. A section of it ran along a ravine, and if a few head had drifted that way in the storm, they could go over the edge in the confusion and be lost for good. "Take someone with you," Maeve said, standing in the doorway, with a lantern in her hand. "Everyone else is dead on their feet. Won't take long. I know that fence blind." She didn't like it, said as much, but he was already pulling his coat tighter and heading back out into the white, and there was nothing to do but watch him go and trust he knew this land better than the storm did. An hour passed, then another. The wind screamed against the house, rattling the shutters, and Maeve found herself pacing the length of the parlor, unable to sit, unable to focus on anything. The ledgers on the desk forgotten entirely. When the door finally burst open, it wasn't Silas walking through it under his own power. It was Silas half-carried by one of the hands. Tom, a young man barely 20, his face white with more than just cold. "Steer got him," Tom said, breathless, hauling Silas toward the fire. Panicked in the drift, half wild with the storm, caught him with a horn before he could get clear. Blood soaked through Silas's coat at the side, dark and spreading fast, and his face had gone gray, eyes glassy with shock. Maeve's training kicked in before her fear had a chance to take hold. The same instinct that had let her survive 12 years under her uncle's roof, now turning itself towards something worth fighting for. "Get him on the table," she said, voice sharp and steady. "Tom, put more wood on that fire and get me every clean cloth in the house. Ruth, I need the whiskey, the sewing kit, and a knife heated over the flame." They laid him out on the kitchen table, and Maeve cut away his shirt with hands that shook only slightly, revealing a gash along his ribs, deep and ugly, still bleeding steady. She'd never stitched a wound this bad before, had only watched Martha do it once on a ranch hand years ago, and remembered every detail out of sheer necessity, the way she remembered everything that might, one day, save her. "This is going to hurt," she told him, and Silas, fading in and out, managed a rough huff of breath that might have been a laugh. Figured that much. She poured whiskey into the wound first, watched him arch off the table with a strangled shout, then pressed the heated knife blade flat against the worst of the bleeding to cauterize it, the smell sharp and awful in the small kitchen, Tom holding him steady while he thrashed against the pain. Then she threaded the needle Ruth handed her and began to stitch, slow and careful, hands finding a steadiness she didn't know she had until the moment demanded it. It took the better part of an hour. By the end, Silas had gone quiet, drifting in and out of consciousness from the pain and the blood loss, and Maeve wrapped the wound tight with clean cloth, checked his pulse against her fingers, and didn't let herself stop moving until the work was done. "He's going to need watching through the night," she told Ruth. "Fever could set in. I'll sit up with him." Ruth didn't argue. She'd seen enough in the last hour to understand there was no separating this girl from that task tonight. Not for anything short of the roof caving in. They moved him to his own bed once he was stable enough, and Maeve pulled a chair beside it, wrapped in a quilt against the cold that still crept through the walls, despite the roaring fire down the hall. The Winchester rifle from the gun case in the parlor sat across her lap, loaded, because with the storm still howling and Silas laid up helpless, she wasn't about to leave the house undefended if anything else went wrong that night. Wolves drawn by the smell of blood, or worse. She sat vigil for hours, checking his temperature by hand every so often, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth when the fever crept in near midnight, murmuring to him, though she didn't know if he could hear her, telling him about the ledgers, about the case building against her uncle, about anything at all, just to fill the silence and keep her own mind from spiraling into fear. Near dawn, the storm finally broke, wind dying down to a low moan, and Silas's eyes opened, glassy but clearer than they'd been in hours. He found her sitting there, rifle across her lap, lantern burning low, dark circles under her eyes from a night without sleep. "You stayed." "Course I stayed." She set the rifle aside and leaned forward, checking his forehead with the back of her hand, relief washing through her at how much cooler he felt. "Fever's breaking. You're going to be all right." "The rifle," he said, a ghost of a smile pulling at his cracked lips. "You planning on shooting something?" "Planning on protecting you," she corrected. "If anything came sniffing around while you were too weak to do it yourself." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his expression. The kind of look a man gives when pain has stripped away his usual defenses and left only the truth underneath. "Nobody's ever sat up all night to protect me before," he said quietly. "Man in my position. Folks expect the protecting to run the other direction." "Maybe that's the trouble with how folks expect things to run," Maeve said, tucking the quilt tighter around his shoulders. "Protecting isn't something only one person in a partnership gets to do. I told you once, we're partners. That doesn't stop just because you're the one bleeding this time." He reached out, weak but deliberate, and found her hand where it rested on the edge of the bed, closing his fingers around hers. "Partners," he echoed, and fell back into an exhausted sleep before she could answer. But she stayed right where she was, hand held loosely in his, watching the first gray light of dawn creep through the frost-covered window, and thought that maybe, for the first time in her whole life, she'd found somewhere worth staying, and someone worth fighting to keep. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did in the high country. Snow retreating grudgingly up the mountain slopes, roads turning to mud before they finally firmed up enough to travel. By the time the first green shoots pushed through the thawing ground, Silas had healed enough to be back on his horse most days, though Maeve still caught him pressing a hand to his ribs when he thought nobody was watching. Something had shifted between them since that night in the storm, something neither of them had bothered naming out loud, yet but both of them understood plainly enough. The careful distance they'd kept in those first weeks, employer and hired help, protector and protected, had worn away entirely, replaced by an ease that showed up in small things. The way he waited for her opinion before making a decision about the herd. The way she'd taken to sitting beside him on the porch in the evenings instead of retreating to her room the moment supper was cleared. They talked more now, too. Long conversations that stretched past dark, about her childhood before her parents died, about his years, building this ranch up from nothing after coming west, with barely a dollar to his name, about the kind of life either of them had ever let themselves imagine. It was the sort of talking that came easy between two people who'd already proven to each other, through mud and blood and long winter nights, that they could be trusted. One evening in early April, sitting together on the porch steps while the last light faded gold over the pasture, Silas reached over and took her hand, careful, like he expected her to pull away. Even after everything they'd been through, she didn't pull away. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what happens once this business with your uncle is settled, about what you might want, once you're not looking over your shoulder anymore." "I haven't let myself think that far," Maeve admitted. "Spent so long just trying to survive the next day. I don't rightly know how to plan past it. Maybe we plan together." Then his thumb traced slow, absent circles across the back of her hand. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. Maeve, I've come to care for you. More than I figured I'd let myself care for anybody again, if I'm honest about it. And I don't want you thinking there's any debt attached to that, any expectation. It's just true, plain as the sky's blue." Her chest went tight, warm. Something she'd never let herself feel before because feeling it had always seemed dangerous, a thing that could be used against her later. But nothing about this felt like danger. It felt like solid ground after years of walking on ice. "I care for you too," she said quietly, been trying not to say it. "On account of, I don't rightly know how to trust something good without waiting for it to turn. Well, he leaned closer, forehead nearly touching hers. Reckon we've got time to work on that trusting. Together, once the business with Elias is handled. They didn't kiss that night. Not yet. Both of them aware that something so important as this deserved more than a stolen moment on the porch steps with unfinished business still hanging over their heads. But the closeness between them settled into something new and steady. A quiet understanding that this, whatever it was becoming, was worth protecting properly once the threat to Maeve's safety had passed. And the threat hadn't passed. If anything, it had only grown more urgent. Maeve had spent the winter months building her case with methodical care, copying every relevant entry from the ranch ledgers into a separate set of books, cross-referencing dates and names until the pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to look at the numbers honestly. Silas had ridden out to 3 neighboring ranches once the roads cleared enough to travel. Quiet conversations with ranchers who'd lost cattle over the past year, and every single one of them, once shown the pattern Maeve had uncovered, recognized the truth of it immediately. They'd all assumed their losses were bad luck, wolves or careless hands. None of them had thought to compare notes with their neighbors, and none of them had a ledger clerk sharp enough to spot the thread tying it all together. They're angry, Silas told her one evening, back from a visit to the Boyd Ranch, 2 valleys over. The very name that had first tipped Maeve off to the fraud. Boyd's ready to ride into town with a rope. The second, we've got enough proof to hang the accusation on your uncle proper. Had to talk him down some. Told him we needed this done right, through the law, or Elias walks free on a technicality and does it all again somewhere else. He won't just let this go quiet, Maeve said, worry creeping into her voice despite herself. If he finds out what I know, what we've built against him, he won't wait around to get arrested. He'll come after us first. Try to silence it before it reaches a judge. Silas's jaw set hard. The same look he'd worn the day he stood between her and her uncle's raised hand, back at the trading post. That's why we're not waiting to be caught flat-footed. I've been quietly getting word to every rancher who lost stock this past year, letting them know what you found, letting them know when we're ready to move, when Elias comes for us, and he will. He's not going to find 2 people alone out here. Maeve looked out over the darkening pasture, thinking of the girl who used to hide coins in her apron and sleep with crumbs of bread tucked under her pillow, too afraid to trust that safety could last past sundown. That girl felt very far away now, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, plainly enough to fight for it in the open, with proof instead of fear, with allies instead of silence. Let him come, then, she said, and meant it. I'm done being afraid of that man in the dark. If he wants a reckoning, we'll give him one, out in the daylight, where everyone can see exactly what he is. Silas squeezed her hand, pride plain on his face. That's my girl, he murmured, and the words settled warm and certain between them. A promise of the fight still ahead, and the life waiting for them once it was finally won. The riders came at midday, when the sun sat high enough that there'd be no mistaking who approached the ranch. Maeve was hanging wash on the line behind the house when she heard the horses, 3 of them by the sound, moving at a pace that wasn't friendly. She dropped the shirt she was pinning and walked around to the front yard, and her stomach turned cold at what she found. Elias sat his horse in front of the house, dressed sharp for once, his good coat buttoned all the way up, like he was heading to church instead of what he actually intended. Beside him rode Sheriff Cole Ruggins, a heavy-set man with a mustache stained yellow from tobacco, and a reputation in town for looking the other way whenever it suited his purse. A deputy trailed a step behind, young and nervous, eyes darting between the ranch hands who'd started drifting in from the barn and fields at the sound of hooves. Miss Sullivan, Ruggins touched the brim of his hat, but there was nothing polite in his voice. Got a warrant here for your arrest. Maeve's chin came up. On what charge? Embezzlement. Elias' voice rang out loud enough for every hand in the yard to hear. The same performance he'd always favored. Loud words meant to convince a crowd before anyone had a chance to think it through. This girl stole from my trading post for years, cooking the books behind my back. I've got proof. You've got nothing, Maeve said, except a warrant you likely paid for. Watch your tongue, girl, or I'll add slander to the list. Silas came out onto the porch then, drawn by the commotion, and Maeve watched something harden in his face the second he took in the scene. Elias Smuggleshorse, the sheriff with a folded paper in his hand, the deputy shifting his weight. Like he already knew, this wasn't going to end clean. Sheriff, Silas came down the porch, steps slow. No rush in him at all, though his eyes never left Ruggins. Mind if I see that warrant? Ruggins hesitated a beat, too long before handing it down. Silas unfolded it. Read it through once, twice, his jaw working the whole while. This is dated 3 days ago, he said. Signed by Judge Pruitt out of the county seat. Man hasn't set foot in this territory in over a year, far as I know. You mind explaining how he came to sign a warrant for a woman he's never laid eyes on? Based on evidence, I'd wager he's never seen either. Judge Pruitt reviewed the complaint, Ruggins said, but there was a flicker in his eyes. The look of a man reciting words he hadn't thought hard enough about. Elias here brought sworn testimony. Receipts, the whole matter, proper and legal. Sworn testimony from who? Maeve asked. Which of your customers ever caught me stealing so much as a penny? I balanced your books to the last cent for years. Uncle, you know that better than anyone. Elias's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his composure slipped. Just a hair. Just enough for anyone watching. Close to catch it. I've got witnesses. Paid witnesses, Silas said flatly. Same way, you've got a warrant from a judge who's never met the accused, and a sheriff who's known through 3 counties for looking the other way when the price is right. That's a serious accusation. Thorne, Ruggins's hand drifted toward his gun. Slow, deliberate. One I could take offense to. Take whatever offense you like. Silas didn't move, didn't reach for his own weapon, but he planted himself squarely between Ruggins and the porch steps, between the sheriff and Maeve, and his voice dropped into something low and hard as flint. But you're not taking her off this land today. Not on a warrant that won't survive a real judge's scrutiny for 5 minutes. The yard had gone dead quiet. Every ranch hand stood frozen where they'd gathered, watching, and Maeve was distantly aware that some of them had drifted toward the bunkhouse, toward where rifles were kept for wolves and worse, though none of them had drawn yet. I've got the law behind me, Ruggins said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. You've got a piece of paper, Silas said, bought and paid for by a man who's been stealing cattle out from under half this valley for the better part of a year, and who needs Miss Sullivan silenced before that theft comes to light. That's what you've got. Sheriff, question is whether you knew that when you rode out here, or whether Elias's money bought your ignorance along with your badge. Elias's face had gone the color of old brick. That's a lie. Is it? Silas reached into his coat, slow, and Ruggins's hand tensed on his gun before Silas pulled out nothing more than a folded stack of papers, holding them up plain for everyone to see. I've got manifests here. I've got testimony from 4 ranchers in this valley who lost cattle over the past year. Cattle that turned up. Sold through your trading post under names that don't belong to anyone living within 100 miles of here. Maeve found the pattern in your own ledgers. The ones you trusted her to keep because you never once suspected the girl you'd broken down for 12 years might be smart enough to see straight through you. Lies, Elias spat, but his voice cracked on the word, and the crowd of ranch hands had gone very still and very interested. Ruggins looked between Silas and Elias, calculation plain on his face. A man weighing which side of this was more likely to leave him standing when the dust settled. I want to see those papers, he said finally. You'll see them, Silas said, in front of a proper judge, alongside every rancher in this valley. Elias has been quietly robbing, not out here, on my land. Where you thought you could drag a woman away on a warrant nobody bothered to question. The standoff hung there, brittle as ice on a pond, everyone waiting to see which way it would crack. Elias's hand had drifted toward the pistol at his own hip, and Ruggins hadn't fully committed either way. And Maeve understood in that moment that this could turn into something none of them walked away from clean. Silas's own hand had come to rest, easy but ready, on his Colt, and Maeve saw in his shoulders the same stillness he'd worn the day he stepped between her and her uncle's raised fist. A man entirely prepared to stand his ground, even if it cost him everything. Silas, she said quietly. He didn't look at her. Eyes fixed on Ruggins and Elias both. Go inside. Maeve. No. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Steady enough to cut through the tension hanging over the yard. I'm not hiding behind you while you die for me, on my own account. Not today. Not ever. Maeve walked down the porch steps, slow, deliberate, and every eye in the yard turned to follow her, Elias's included, his face twisting between fury and something closer to fear now that his carefully built lie was showing its cracks in front of witnesses. She reached Silas's side and put her hand flat against the barrel of his Colt, pushing it gently but firmly back down toward the holster. I won't watch you die a martyr on my account, she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it clearly. This isn't your fight to bleed for alone. It's mine too. Let me finish it. Silas's jaw was tight, every instinct in him clearly screaming to keep his hand on that gun. But he read something in her face, a certainty that hadn't been there in the girl who used to bow her head and hide coins in her apron. And he let his hand drop away from the weapon. Maeve turned to face her uncle directly, chin high, and reached into the satchel she'd carried out with her. One she must have grabbed the moment she heard the horses, and pulled out the thick ledger she'd spent the winter copying, by lamplight, entry by entry, proof stacked on proof. She threw it down into the mud at the foot of Elias's horse. There's your proof. Uncle, she said, every stolen head of cattle, every fake name you invented to sell them under. Every ranch in this valley you've been quietly bleeding dry for a year, while you called me worthless in front of a room full of strangers. Elias looked down at the ledger in the mud, and for a moment something like real fear flickered across his face before he covered it with a sneer. Paper, he said, forcing a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. You think a book of numbers written by a lying, thieving girl means anything against a badge. Sheriff, arrest her. Now Ruggins hesitated, gaze flicking between the ledger in the mud and the crowd of ranch hands gathered close. And in that hesitation, the barn doors at the edge of the yard creaked open. A dozen men stepped out into the daylight. Ranchers Maeve, recognized from Silas's quiet rides through the valley over the past weeks. Men who'd lost cattle and blamed wolves, and bad luck until a ledger clerk with a gift for numbers had shown them the truth. Boyd stood at the front of them, a copy of the same evidence clutched in one fist, his face hard as granite. That girl's numbers matched my losses to the head, Boyd called out, voice carrying clean across the yard. 14 cattle I lost last fall. Every one of them sold through Vance's post under a name that don't exist. I rode 2 counties checking. Sheriff. There's no rancher named Cutler within 100 miles of here. Another rancher stepped forward, and another, each one adding their own account, their own losses, their own matching entries in Elias's crooked manifests, until the weight of testimony standing in that yard made the single-folded warrant in Ruggins's hand look like exactly what it was. A desperate man's last attempt to silence the one person smart enough to catch him. Elias's composure finally broke entirely. He wheeled his horse, looking for an escape that wasn't there, hemmed in by ranchers on one side and the porch on the other. This is a setup, he shouted, voice cracking. A conspiracy against an honest businessman, honest. Silas's voice cut through the noise, flat and cold. You call 12 years of breaking a child down to nothing honest. You call stealing from your neighbors while they trusted you honest. Ruggins looked at the ledger in the mud, at the dozen angry ranchers with matching evidence, at the warrant in his own hand that suddenly looked less like protection and more like a noose tightening around his own neck, and made the only calculation that mattered to a man like him. Self-preservation. Elias Vance, he said, Voice suddenly loud and official. You're under arrest for cattle theft and fraud. What? Elias's head whipped toward him. I paid you. The words hung in the air, damning, and Ruggins's face went pale as he realized what he'd just let slip in front of a dozen witnesses. That's enough out of you, Ruggins snapped, moving fast now to cover his own exposure, grabbing for Elias's reins and hauling him down off the horse before the man could think to run. Deputy, get the irons. Elias fought, cursed spat threats that grew increasingly desperate as the deputy clapped iron cuffs around his wrists, and the ranchers who'd gathered in the yard watched with grim satisfaction as the man who'd stolen from half the valley finally faced the reckoning he'd spent a year avoiding. Maeve stood very still through all of it, watching her uncle drag toward the sheriff's horse, and she waited for some rush of triumph to hit her, some sense of victory she'd earned through 12 hard years. Instead, what came was something quieter. Relief, mostly. The simple, bone-deep relief of a threat finally lifted, of a debt she'd never actually owed, finally declared, paid in full by the truth itself. You'll hang for this. Elias snarled at her as they hauled him past. Ungrateful. Worthless. I'm not worthless, Maeve said, and her voice didn't shake at all. I never was. You just needed me to believe it so you could keep using me. That's over now. Elias had nothing left to say to that. Ruggins mounted up, keeping a tight grip on the lead rope now tied to Elias's saddle, casting one last uneasy glance at the crowd of ranchers who'd witnessed his own slip of the tongue. This isn't finished, Ruggins muttered, mostly to himself, and rode off toward town with his prisoner in tow, the deputy trailing behind, leaving the yard full of ranchers, dust, and a silence that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely safe. Boyd walked over and clapped Silas on the shoulder, then turned to Maeve and tipped his hat, genuine respect plain on his weathered face. Owe you a debt, Miss Sullivan. Whole valley does. Wouldn't have caught that thief in 100 years without your eye for numbers. Maeve managed to smile, exhausted but real. Just glad it's over. Ain't quite over, Boyd said. Man like that. He'll try to buy his way out if he can. But he's got a dozen witnesses now, instead of none, and a ledger to prove it. Reckon that'll be enough to see real justice done. Justice, as it turned out, moved slower than Maeve would have liked, but it moved steady and it moved true. The trial took place in the county seat 6 weeks later, presided over by an actual judge this time, a stern woman named Judge Alden, who had no patience for corruption of any stripe. Boyd and the other ranchers testified. Maeve laid out her ledger's entry by entry, calm and precise, and the prosecutor barely needed to ask a second question, because her numbers spoke plainer than any witness could. Sheriff Ruggins lost his badge within the week, his own slip of the tongue in the ranch yard having been overheard by enough witnesses to end any hope of quietly burying the matter. Elias Vance was found guilty on every count and sentenced to a decade in the territorial prison, his trading post seized and sold to cover the restitution owed to every rancher he'd stolen from. And in the course of the trial, digging through old county records to establish the full scope of Elias's fraud, the lawyers uncovered something Maeve hadn't known existed. Her parents, dead since she was 12, had left behind a modest inheritance, land and savings meant for her, which Elias had quietly absorbed into his own accounts the moment he became her guardian, never once mentioning its existence in 12 years of calling her a charity case who owed him everything. Maeve sued for it and won without much fight at all, the evidence of her uncle's fraud already so thoroughly documented that no judge in the territory would have ruled against her. She stood in Judge Alden's courtroom on the day the ruling came down, papers in hand confirming what was rightfully hers, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since she was a girl of 12, standing at her parents' graves, wondering what would become of her. She wasn't worthless. She never had been. She'd simply spent 12 years surrounded by a man who needed her to believe that lie so he could keep profiting off her labor. The truth, laid out plain in a courtroom full of witnesses, said otherwise. Spring had fully arrived, by the time she and Cecil rode back to the ranch together. The mountains green now instead of white, wildflowers pushing up along the road they'd first traveled together in a storm nearly a year before. "What will you do?" Silas asked her. "With your inheritance. Land like that. You could build a life anywhere you choose now. Nobody holding you here." Maeve considered the question seriously. Turning it over the way, she turned over a column of figures, looking for the truth underneath. "I don't want to build a life anywhere," she said finally. "I want to build it here. With you, if you'll have me as more than hired help." Silas pulled his horse up short, turning to look at her fully, something raw and hopeful crossing his weathered face. "Maeve Sullivan, are you proposing to me?" "Might be," she said, a smile tugging at her mouth. "Seems only fair. Given you handed me a contract instead of buying me like property the first time we met, figured I'd return the courtesy." He laughed, real and warm, and swung down off his horse to help her down from hers, though she hardly needed the help anymore. Hadn't needed rescuing in a long while now. He caught her around the waist anyway, just because he wanted to. "And she let him, I'd be honored," he said, on one condition, which is, you buy in as a full partner, 50-50. Your name right alongside mine on every deed and every ledger. I won't have you thinking for one second this is charity. Same as I told you that first day. You've earned every inch of this ranch twice over." Maeve's eyes stung, but she was smiling too wide to care. 50-50, she agreed. Partners in every sense of the word. They married that summer. A small ceremony on the porch where Silas had first draped his coat over her shoulders and told her the truth about her own worth, surrounded by the ranch hands who'd become something like family, and Ruth, who cried through most of it, and a handful of the valley ranchers who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with them the day Elias finally faced his reckoning. Maeve used part of her inheritance to buy into the ranch properly, just as promised. Her name added to every deed alongside his. And together they expanded the herd, hired on more hands, built a life neither of them could have imagined back when they were two wounded people circling each other with careful distance, unsure whether kindness could ever come without a price attached. On a clear evening in late summer, the two of them stood together on the porch, looking out over the pasture where their cattle grazed gold in the fading light. The mountains standing tall and steady behind them. "You didn't pull me out of the dark, Silas," Maeve said, leaning into him, his arm settling easy around her waist. "You just handed me the lantern. The rest, I found my own way through." Silas pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his voice a low, steady rumble against the quiet evening. "And I'll spend the rest of my days making sure that fire never goes out." They stood there a long while, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. Two people who'd learned the hard way that a person's worth was never something to be counted, doled out, or taken away by anyone else's cruelty. It simply was, steady as the mountains, waiting only to be seen. And somewhere along a muddy road, a stolen coin, and a long winter of stitched wounds and shared ledgers. They had each finally found someone willing to see it plain. Maeve spent 12 years believing she was worthless, because that's what she was told, over and over, until the lie started to feel like fact. That's how it works, isn't it? Nobody wakes up one day and decides they're not worth anything. It gets built into them, brick, by people who benefit from them staying small. Elias didn't just steal cattle and coin from that girl. He stole her sense of what she was owed simply for existing. And the cruelest part is, she almost believed him. She hid bread under her pillow. She offered her own body to settle a debt that was never hers to pay. That's what 12 years of being told you're nothing does to a person. It doesn't just bruise you. It rewires what you think you deserve. But here's the thing the story wants you to sit with. Silas never rescued her. Not really. He didn't sweep in and hand her a new life. What he did was simpler, and honestly, harder. He handed her a contract instead of a cage. He gave her a plank to dig out the wagon wheel instead of telling her to sit pretty and wait. He left bread outside her door instead of asking anything in return. Every single thing he did was designed to hand her back her own agency, not take it for himself. That's the real definition of love in this story. Not rescue, respect. And Maeve, for her part, didn't wait around to be saved. She's the one who cracked the case wide open. She's the one who walked down those porch steps and threw the ledger in the mud herself, instead of hiding behind a man with a gun. That's the whole arc right there. A woman who was taught her voice didn't matter, learning that it was the only thing that ever really did. If there's a lesson here worth carrying into your own life, maybe it's this. Worth was never something anyone else got to hand you or take away, no matter how many years they spent trying to convince you otherwise. It was always yours. Sometimes it just takes one person, one moment, one stranger with dust on his boots, to say it out loud before you can believe it yourself. And sometimes it takes proving it to yourself, alone in a barn at midnight with a stack of manifests, before anybody else gets the chance to say it at all. So if this story hit something in you today, if some part of you recognized Maeve in that opening scene, kneeling with her head down, keeping her hands busy so nobody looked too close at her face, I hope you walk away remembering the ending instead. The porch, the partnership, the fire that never goes out. That's what's waiting on the other side of believing you're worth more than what you've been told. Thank you for spending this time with Maeve and Silas. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. I'll see you in the next one. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.